What do you wish every birth professional knew about reversing VBAC bans?
For those who are holding up bans at their facilities, I would ask you to pause and think about what you're doing to families. Like, it's really, really heavy to rip that option away
Yeah.
from families or force them to fight in a moment that should be free of fighting.
Hello, hello. Welcome to the VBAC Facts podcast. I'm Jen Kamel, VBAC Facts founder. And since 2007, our focus has been to provide accurate and objective information on vaginal birth after cesarean and repeat cesarean to parents, professionals, policymakers, and the court. And today I am really excited to have Anastasia Stone with us to discuss her journey of 10 years of reversing a VBAC ban in her community. And I just want to share a little bit with you about who Anastasia is. Anastasia is a dedicated mother of 5, a compassionate birth doula with 15 years of experience, and the current president of the International Cesarean Awareness Network. Residing in Santa Barbara, California, she passionately advocates for maternal health autonomy and improved outcomes through collaboration and holistic care. Anastasia envisions a future where childbirth is free of fear of mistreatment and where every birthing individual is treated with respect. With 2 cesarean births of her own, she particularly empathizes with families navigating similar experiences and believes that when cesareans are necessary, it's essential to provide care that addresses both physical and emotional needs to minimize trauma. Welcome, Anastasia. I'm so excited to have you with me today.
Thanks for having me, Jen. It's so fun.
Yeah. So, can you share with us, how did you become involved with birth work? What was your journey?
Yeah. So I count back to like when I got trained, which was about, oh my gosh, wildly 16 years ago, I think, next month.
We're,
Can't believe it's been.
yeah.
But before that, I was working with moms that were in crisis in various situations, and some of them were having babies and no one was going with them. So I started to go with them. And then I was like, oh, maybe I should do something about that. So at that point, when I got trained, I had 2 babies. And so I was like, all right, I'll go get something to help me out. And then it's just kind of exploded and evolved because I think when you have the heart and then you get in there and you start doing the work, you're like, oh, okay, this is like bigger than I thought it was.
Based on your interactions with physicians and nurses, anesthesiologists, what do you think influences their perspective on VBAC?
I mean, I look at it and I think a lot of things influence it, just like all of life, right? Like our experiences. So, did they have a hard outcome that they're maybe holding on to and they haven't processed and it's become bigger than what the reality is around things? Or on the flip side, did they have their own cesarean birth and their own VBAC and then that also influences it? Yeah, I think that those are probably almost always the factors that are playing in. So I think over these last 16 years, I really try to see the person as human. Like it's really easy to just be like, they're against us. And I'm like, okay, they're human. Like, what's going on here? What's the story behind this? And how can I connect with them so that we can get to a deeper space of, hey, what you're bringing into the room and how is that affecting the person in front of you? That's what I try to do. It's hard sometimes because sometimes you just feel like, you guys are just against us. And I'm sure there are people who are just like, yeah, I'm against it. This is the way I want to do it. And it doesn't really have to do with personal experience. It has more to do with just being prideful and digging their heels in. But more often than not, I think when you can make a human connection, you can often get the tide to turn a little bit.
Can you tell me what that process looks like when you talk about making a human connection? There's a lot of emotional baggage and there's a lot of stuff surrounding VBAC. And so I think sometimes people really have their walls up in terms of like, this is what I'm comfortable with, this is what I'm willing to do, and that's it. How do you break through that? How are you able to kind of break a brick off that wall?
Yeah, I always try to start with questions like, so what are you thinking? Or have you thought about? Or and just kind of not telling. And, sometimes in this 10-year journey of the VBAC ban, that's not just me by any means fighting it and doing all of these things. We, as a group, especially when there was media coverage, asked really hard questions. And you played a role in that too, in helping us to ask really hard questions, but not confronting it with "you're totally wrong," but things like, okay, you're saying that you can't do this because there could be an emergency. And so ultimately, if you're telling me that you can't deal with this emergency that's specifically related to VBAC, but doesn't only happen with VBAC, does that mean that you're not prepared for an emergency? The ultimate question is this hospital prepared to deal with obstetrical emergencies or not? It doesn't really matter whether it's VBAC or not. It just matters, are you prepared for that? It takes the fighting down a bit because it's a question. It's not saying like, hey, you're mean, you're horrible, you don't like us. It's just, hey, are you able to do this? So there's that piece. When I first became a member of ICANN, we have like a leadership group, and I got a lot of ideas from there. And so there was one leader that was like, well, I just go get my annuals from different OBs every year. I'm done having kids. And I start asking them questions to see
So
where they're
smart.
at. And then you make a connection. There's a famous story. I won't name who it is that I did this with, but if you know me and if you live in this town, you will know who it is. So I was like, okay, I'll do that. And I like Googled and I found this young doctor and made an appointment and went in, and we connected and now have a relationship, still 10 years later. That
It is so funny that that's
good.
how you two met. So she really knows you.
Oh yes, that's the other joke too. But I also it was interesting because you also see different people's personalities. It was said to me, oh well, when I was at this place and we did them all the time, we placed epidurals in every VBAC client. We didn't necessarily give them medicine, but we placed the catheter. And I sometimes I like pause and sometimes I don't, and I'm just like, whatever I'm thinking comes out. And I was like, really, why? Because I had a TOLAC that ended in a repeat cesarean, and I was like, no one it wasn't brought up. Her response wasn't like to fight me. It was like, oh, really? Well, what'd they do? She was curious. And so I think when you find those people that are curious, that also changes things, because you're like, oh, we can talk and we can kind of, walk this out, because none of this is black and white. It's just not black and white. And it reminds me of, you will remember this because it was your first panel up here, but when Emiliano said, someone asked like, what's too risky or something like that. And he goes, I don't know. Yeah. What's risky to one person isn't risky to another person. And he talked about riding motorcycles and how his mom hated it, and, all these different things. And I think that when it comes down to it, I always come back to that. That's stuck in my head for however many years it's been since we did that first panel, like 9 years. That when I'm talking to someone and they're really struggling with the risk about it all, I just look at them and I go, but what's risky for you isn't risky for someone else. And maybe something that's not risky for you is risky for them.
Yeah. Yep.
It's about them at the end of the day. Yeah. Whoever they are and whatever it is that they're facing. And that kind of goes in a lot of ways beyond VBAC, but just into all of things. So, yeah, that went off a little bit, but.
That's okay. That's okay. So when did you become aware of Cottage's VBAC ban? Because you've lived all your life in Santa Barbara, right?
No. So I grew up in LA. I met my husband in Orange County. We lived in Santa Cruz, where there was no VBAC ban, at least while we were there. Okay. But he grew up in Santa Barbara. So I was always connected to what was going on. I knew when the birth center opened. We had friends here, and it was definitely the connection with friends. I know actually 100% one thing that stands out in my mind was a friend that had a vaginal birth and then a C-section on her second. And then she went for she was having her third, and she said, well, I'm not going to VBAC because they don't offer VBACs anymore. And she had that third in the time frame where the option for VBAC was no longer available in town. Okay. And I say option. I mean, technically, you always have the legal option, but she felt like it wasn't available to her anymore. And she didn't want to drive to Ventura because it felt too hard with 2 little kids
Yeah.
and being pregnant. And so for those out there listening that don't know, Ventura is about 45 minutes away from us without traffic. If you get traffic, it can be longer. So this is not like a hop, skip, and a jump easy thing to do. It's, it takes time and energy and a lot of commitment to do it. And it's hard for people. And so I remember her saying that and me just being kind of flabbergasted because we were living in Santa Cruz. Santa Cruz was smaller or is smaller population wise. And I was just like, how is VBAC just readily available here? It's not a question. It's not a fight. It's not in anything. And no one has access. It blew my mind. So I would follow it and pay attention to the news stories before we even moved here. And then we moved here very late 2014. So I just call it 2015 when we moved here.
And so you were already aware of the ban by the time you moved to Santa Barbara. And how was the rationale of the ban explained to you? What was your understanding of why they even had the ban in the first place?
There's the understory.
Yes.
And then there's what was said to the public. So what the public was kind of told, we don't have anesthesia in-house 24 hours. And so we can't offer it because that's what ACOG says, which it's not what ACOG said at the time at all. In fact, ACOG at that point, when those were the answers we were getting, had already corrected the statement that had caused confusion in a lot of VBAC bans. So they were not basing it off of even the current recommendations from ACOG. That was the outward, that was the line that was said, that was the political thing to say. Then there were the myths. People thought it was illegal.
Yes.
There were literally people that thought it was illegal to have a VBAC at Cottage. When I moved here, our youngest, who are twins, were really young. And so I wasn't doing doula work. And I was just like, but I want to help with this. I can't not do anything. I wanted to start. There was no ICANN chapter. I knew about ICANN because we had an ICANN chapter in Santa Cruz and I had helped a little bit with it. Then when I called, Virginia had literally a month before started the process and had said, but I really need a co-leader, and had no idea, never met her before. I didn't know her at all. And so they were like, actually, someone just reached out, but they really wanted help. They didn't really want to do it on their own. And so they connected us and she essentially started it. And I came right there at the beginning with her. And because she had lived here for so long and had done so much birth work, she was like, people don't even know it's an option.
Yeah.
They literally think it's illegal.
Yeah.
We didn't have access technically in Ventura either. We had some undercover doctors that would do it, but it wasn't technically an option. And we were like, okay, so step one was let's start undoing the myths and making people aware that it's an option. And that was the birth. And the whole idea, it started as the VBAC panel and we morphed it into the maternal health panel just to deal with broader issues, prevention and things. But it's all Virginia. That was her idea. Then Kristen said, we should call Jen Kamel because she went to UCSB and I bet you
It's true.
she would want to come. And so she reached out to you. Then Stu thought he had to be at a birth, so he called Emiliano, and that was the birth of the first panel to undo the myth that were permeating this town in a way that was just heartbreaking, that women literally thought it's illegal. And we could start saying, actually, it's illegal for them to force you into that surgery.
Yeah. That was such a fun night.
It was. It was so good.
What was your experience of how OBs, nurses, anesthesiologists at Cottage responded to the ban or felt about the ban?
Yeah, it was a mixed bag for sure at the beginning, but definitely weighted more on the side of fear around VBAC. Historically, there were 3 hospitals, and at this point, we're down to 1. And that hospital had actually had a ban since, 2000 maybe. So even longer than there was actually a lack of access, right? Because the other 2 hospitals were doing them and Cottage was the only one not. So you had this administration that had not been doing them for, 15 years. And all that does is feed your fear. Now we haven't done them in a while. So now we're even more afraid. Whatever it was that started the fear has now been fed. for 15 years with just lack of witnessing it happening safely. I think what we saw over time with not just the education piece, but as you got a newer crops of doctors, younger doctors and younger nurses that were new and fresh and came with a fresh energy, they were coming from places that were doing VBACs all the time. And they were confused because the answer that they were giving was like, go to UCLA, you need to be at a university. And they're like, but I didn't work at a university and we did them. Or I did, I worked here and we did them. And we just had a plan. That was it. Like we had a plan. So that started to create, even among the clinicians, that status quo line wasn't working anymore. To just be like, we can't do it. It forced the conversation quite a bit. And then it also shifted when Ventura said, we're going to start doing them. And so that shifted it as well, because they're, really similar in size, staffing, resources, all of those things were pretty much the same. And so it created this tension, and this hardness with the line that they were giving wasn't working so well anymore.
So when you say hardness, do you mean that they made their ban even more firm? Or do you mean that VBAC being accessible in Ventura made the VBAC ban soften a little bit at Cottage?
I mean, they didn't want you to know that, but I think you could feel it. That they were like, this line isn't playing well in our community anymore. Yeah. These families know too much. They have too much information, which is my plug for why education is so important and so powerful. Once the community was educated, outwardly they were heels dug in. Nope, can't do it. But you could feel the shift, the energetical shift in the community among the nurses and even among the doctors, though they might not, want to say it out loud. You could feel that there was this tension from an educated community that was pushing them. Yeah. And that they were bumping up against, and oh, it's not working anymore to just say this. And you started to hear of women going in and refusing repeat cesareans. Sometimes not met well and sometimes successful, but there was a pushback and it was starting to happen. And it was rubbing against this wall that we thought was so big and thick and impenetrable was starting to break a little bit.
Could you identify any patterns among the people who went in and declined a repeat cesarean in the face of the VBAC ban in terms of which of those denials were successful? What are the best practices for refusing a C-section when you go into a hospital with a VBAC ban?
So controlled things, being educated, knowing what ACOG says, printing that out, putting it in your birth plan, knowing what your legal rights are, just knowing you legally can't do this to me. Medical law autonomy says, even if I'm doing something to the detriment of my life, you can't argue with me. So knowing those things, I would say having a strong partner was a piece of it too, a partner that was equally as committed to standing strong and being a wall, having a doula help, which was really hard for the doulas that were going in with people like that. That's not an easy thing to be there and hold space with, because that spotlight's on you to deny, So I think those are the pieces that are definitely controllables. Education, again, I'll probably say this 500 million times, is the biggest piece.
Say it.
Knowing what the actual statistics are, because they would, whether they were knowingly or unknowingly, would lie about them quite often. And we would hear the stories. Tell them to give you the study, because I've never seen a study that says 10%.
Yeah.
What are we looking at? Someone who could take in things well, that's like riding a motorcycle without a helmet on. That's like putting your baby in the car without a seatbelt or a car seat. That kind of stuff would be said, not all the time, but sometimes to people. And so it had to be someone with the resolve to be you're trying to scare me and I'm not going to let you.
Powerful line.
And again, not everyone was met with that, but it did happen sometimes. We all know it's the color of people's skin and economic status. So is someone on Medi-Cal or are they on private insurance? Those two things we definitely saw play a role. There were some people with Medi-Cal that still had success fighting it. And the other thing that was uncontrollable, but it plays a role into when we look at like the building, right? Like the momentum of change was that the people on the front. And so some of the very first people definitely had the hardest time and were the least successful. And then as the years went on and the fight had kind of built, people definitely, it was much, we even got to a place where if people came in and denied, they actually had a paper to sign at cottage saying, we know that there is a VBAC ban and we're having a VBAC anyway.
Yes.
So we did get to some different places as we got further, but we also ran into some pushback despite all of that, where we got to a place where they started denying epidurals. We just this last year on the panel, one of the moms, she shared publicly, it was a prominent medical family in Santa Barbara.
Wow.
And she was like, I did the research. I know medical stuff. And I knew that I wanted more kids. Like I needed to have a VBAC for safety to have a third child. And maybe if I wanted to or decided to a fourth, but definitely even the third. Like I don't want multiplying C-sections. And I believe her first C-section was for breech. And she went into it. She knew that she was going to not be able to get an epidural. And she publicly spoke about how she was very well aware that she wasn't going to get an epidural.
Good for her.
She didn't ask, but she just knew they weren't going to. And she did it anyway. And that was pretty close to the end of the ban. That was the last pushback that was to try to stop people from denying these repeat C-sections. And that's how we knew the pressure was working too. And there was this big, huge pushback. And it was like, well, we're not going to give them epidurals then, which is illegal. And had anyone chosen to, could have sued.
So are you saying she went into cottage, declined a cesarean, and they honored her request, or they did not?
Yeah. So the interesting thing is that also at that point, the nurses thought we should be getting VBACs for the most part.
Power to the nurses.
But also we had the form, right? That's why it felt so odd. It was like we were at this different place where they were like, well, we still have the ban, but yes, you guys have educated everyone. They have the legal right to deny this surgery. And so now all these people are coming in denying the surgery. So what we're going to do is we're going to deny you the epidural as a way to kind of push back. You know, who knows if I said that, how they would respond to it. But what was quite interesting, because I'm sure they would say, oh, safety reasons and blah, 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 like, which doesn't actually add up. And then was so interesting because the first VBAC that I was at post the ban, the anesthesiologist came in because they, come do a little consult when you come in. And I sat there and had to like hold my mouth because they were like, so we recommend early epidurals for all our VBACs or Tolacs. Like, so you've been denying them for 2 years, but now they're recommended for safety circumstances. So if they didn't want to make it more obvious that it was a punishment, they ended up making it very obvious and kind of undeniable because they still say the same thing for every VBAC that comes in. They come in and they encourage an early epidural.
And I also think it shows how arbitrary what so many people view as like healthcare and science, how arbitrary it is depending on who you're speaking to. Because for a period of time, it was safer to deny everyone an epidural, and now it's safer for everyone to have an epidural. That's one thing I tell my kids all the time. Everything is made up. We make everything up. So when people are like, oh, that holiday is made up or this is made up, it's all made up. So with the power of us making it all up is that we can change how we do things. And so this is a perfect example of how literally it is made up. Say it's safer, people will crumble. They will consent. Of course, because we want to do what's safest, right? And so when you wrap any argument in a chocolate coating of safety, people are going to be like, yes, I will do it. But the reality is, it's just wrapped in chocolate and it's just a lie. It's just a
Yep.
lie.
Yeah. Yeah. It's why, I mean, it's so wild that they did it so like polar in front of our face that I'm like, guys, if you didn't think you should question everything, let me remind you. It's not just the 1950s when we handed all the pregnant women cigarettes. Like,
Yeah. Yeah. Oh
it's
my
just different
gosh.
things. It just changed, like it just changed and it changes with who's in front of you at that moment. Yeah.
So, was there a moment, a distinct moment when you decided, I am going to do something about this ban?
I think after doing that first VBAC panel, we were all so fired up that we were like, okay, well, we're not going to let this go. Like, we're going to keep the momentum going. And so we did. And, we did protests and we did different things. And we wrote letters to the editors and people wrote their stories. You can literally just Google Santa Barbara feedback ban and you'll find different articles from different times and different editorials. It's hard to sit back, have education, knowledge, and awareness, which is powerful, and watch people be abused
Yeah.
just because they don't know.
Yes.
We did a VBAC survey and you read those quotes and I would just
Right.
cry. I'm like, she didn't have to go through that. And it wasn't
Yeah.
even just the VBAC. It was like how things were talked about in the surgery. It was how they were treated after surgery. It was that they were never told it was even an option. Like, okay, you don't like VBACs, fine, but not your choice to make.
Yeah.
I think the motivating factor was like, I just couldn't handle watching families go through so much so
Yeah.
unnecessarily. Like, it was just heartbreaking. And I don't like lying. And there was a lot
Yeah.
of lies coming out in the lines, like that this is what ACOG says. And we would send them back a dated, the most recent
Yeah.
thing, highlight everything, and they would be like, nope, like, or ignore it. Yeah. It was just I think that was like the most infuriating piece.
All the different strategies that you tried over the years,
Mhm.
what do you think was the most effective and the most persuasive in terms of how the hospital felt about feedback?
You know what? I don't think they actually changed their feeling about feedback. Not the upper administration. I think they caved to cultural pressure. Anyone who's listening who doesn't know Santa Barbara, it's not a huge town, right? So I go out to the grocery store, I'm bound to run into someone. Everyone kind of knows everyone and ends up with personal connections. So when we talked earlier about personal connections with doctors, that is a piece to it because some of us end up doing life together. And so we're in life together. I think it's the best thing in the world. Like, I think about being in
Okay.
LA and trying to fight this, and I'm like, no, thanks. I'm good. I'll take my tiny town where I end up at a party with you. And you know that I'm a human and have had some of the most amazing conversations in
Yeah.
those moments that I think have really shifted things. But yeah, no, I don't think that they really changed their view. And it's really hard to tell who is in charge of policy. They don't give that away and they kind of all point fingers at each other. This person's not comfortable. Well, it's really that person that's not comfortable with it. So, you know, what's what and who's who, I don't know, but I think they just actually caved to the pressure of the community. And I think a big upswelling of that was COVID. We had a lot of people move here from cities. So from New York, LA, San Francisco, Chicago, like big hub cities came to Santa Barbara because we're very outdoors and, people didn't want to be in big cities. I specifically remember doing a consult on Zoom from a mom who had lived in San Francisco, and she was like, I don't get it. I literally don't understand what's happening here. This is so backwards. And so they got these people who were very well educated, lived in other places, and they were like, what is going on?
Yeah.
What are you guys doing? Why are you making people drive to Ventura? And I think that plus, the education that had happened over all of those years had left women in situations where they're like, no, I'm not putting up with this. Like, I know how to look it up between like you with VBAC facts and like evidence-based birth. And us talking about it and women telling their stories, they're like, no, I know how to open that study. I can go get on VBAC Facts and it takes me 2 seconds and I will find the blurb from ACOG and I'll bring it to you. I don't feel overwhelmed or intimidated. I can read that thing. And I can too, right? Because we have guest speakers and we would break it down and you didn't have to look at a study and feel, because it can be overwhelming, right? It's kind of like legalese when you look at a study.
Yes.
Yeah. Some of them are a little easier to read, but some of them you look at it and you're like, I don't understand. So all of these resources that these families are getting where they can look at the statistics, understand it, and then repeat it back to their provider and say, you say that you're following current evidence. Well, this is what it says. So what's going on? And there was also like the California Maternal Quality Care Collaborative that came about too. So that started pushing things. It was just kind of this like slow build of things and us just kind of constantly pushing the information and constantly saying over and over again, you have rights. You have rights. Don't have to obey these people. So
I think those are really two important points. First, to know the facts. And second, do not comply right off the bat. You know what I mean? Before you even go to the hospital, you're already like, they have a ban, fight is over, guess I'm having a C-section. And knowing the science behind it and knowing your rights, I think really emboldens people to say, this is what I want. And what I want is evidence-based and mainstream. And your policy lies outside of the guidelines. Your policy subjects me to risks. And for people to be able to effectively make that argument, it really does help to have the facts and know your rights.
Yeah, it makes all the difference in the world.
Now, if you want to learn more about VBAC, your very first step should be to join my email list. I'm going to include the links in the description, but if you want to just go to vbacfacts.com/report right now, you can download my uterine rupture report where I debunk the top 5 most common myths I've seen about uterine rupture. Go to vbacfacts.com/checklist to download my 5 simple steps to planning a vaginal birth after cesarean. And go to vbacfacts.com/handout to download the top 3 VBAC myths that I bust using the American College of OBGYN's VBAC guidelines. You might be shocked what you think is true versus what ACOG actually says. Let me help you break it down. Join my email list, download my free resources, and continue learning about VBAC with me. So, what were the most challenging aspects of reversing the ban?
How long it took. It's really hard to do things like send people the actual ACOG statement and watch them just come back with the same old thing. And you're like, there were definite moments where it was like, are they ever going to are they ever going to do it? I mean, we all knew that when they did it, they would not give credit to the fact that the community pushed them to it.
Yeah.
But yeah, it definitely felt hopeless at points. I mean, that's a long time.
Yeah.
It was a long time. And there was a long time of me being in the fight. And then there were all those people before me that were in it. I know they were tired because we were all in it together. And it's just, it was exhausting. It was exhausting.
I'm hearing, learn the facts, know your rights, don't give up.
Yeah. Yeah. And it could take a long time. And I think, right, like in this modern technological era where like everything is instant, you can DoorDash the food to your house, you can, get an answer in 2 seconds. You don't have to go to the library and go search for things. Like nothing takes time. We're kind of conditioned to get things quickly. And so when they take a long time, it really does feel harder. But the reality is that these kinds of things take a really long time.
Yeah.
Because it's cultural change.
Yeah. And you're dealing with people's fears and their emotions, which makes me think, did you encounter more resistance from a particular group than others, like physicians versus nurses versus anesthesiologists versus administration?
I mean, when I first got here, there was a different admin and there was a lot of resistance. Then it changed and there was not as much resistance. And admin over the nurses, we never talked to upper admin. They wouldn't give us the time of day. So I can't really answer that. There's one or two particular OBs that were pretty dug in, like, don't want to do it, where there were others that were softer and you could kind of get them in a moment of like, yeah, we don't do them, but like, yeah, you could see that they really did believe that they could be an option. And there were some that were pretty vocal that it should be an option. There were some that had gotten in trouble before for not following the ban. Some that had gotten in trouble and like just totally flipped and then became very pro the. I mean, it was very interesting how that culture had affected people when you started to talk to community members about the history. So it wasn't all things that I necessarily saw, but more stories that you're hearing and you're like, wow, like this is so powerful. Like the fear. Yeah. It's complicated.
What was the response that you heard from various clinicians? Or
From
any
clinicians, you had a lot of very excited nurses, very happy that was happening. These nurses were fighting for it from the inside too, talking about things, asking questions. So there was a lot of excitement. I think there was probably some hidden excitement from some of the practitioners. And, a lot of like, that took long enough. Like, thanks for, we're finally here. At least no one said anything negative about it. Like there wasn't like negative talk, like, oh, I can't believe we're doing this. Like that didn't happen. So that was good.
And when the ban was reversed, was it a little bit more of an easing in?
Oh, no. I mean, they lifted it. They hired hospitalists, put hospitalists on. And what happened was they said publicly that they were going to lift it July of that year. I'd have to look back for the month, but they ended up not being fully staffed for the hospitalists, but the community knew. And so all these women were like, I'm having my VBAC and just like, I'm not going to Ventura. All the doulas were getting phone calls. Like, I'm having a VBAC now. Like, I'm not having my repeat C-section. I'm going to have a VBAC. And so everyone was getting last minute phone calls. It was quite wild, that response. And then just all of them kind of had to do it, right? Because now it's gone again, small town. So you can't really pull that person's going to do it and this person's not. And then putting care providers into categories, it could also be an ICANN thing. Like, are they VBAC tolerant or actually supportive, right? And there's these kind of like two different categories, or against, but no one could really be against because we're a small place. So you would have really singled yourself out if you did that. And so it was really talking to people about there's going to be providers that are tolerant of it, and they're kind of have to have super straightforward situation. And then there's going to be people who are supportive, and they're going to be talking to you through your pregnancy and like talk to you about doing stretches and, doing all these things to encourage and increase your, success chances. So I think, that's kind of what we started to talk to people about, was like knowing, is your provider tolerant of it or are they actually supportive of it? So,
yeah. And that phrasing of VBAC tolerant versus supportive versus anti, that was actually developed by a retired Texas midwife, Melik Oz. Melik, those concepts have been floating around, but she created a graphic years ago that has been forwarded, and other groups have taken it and edited it and shared it. But she is the creator of that concept. And it's a really important concept. And I would even add another category that I've recently been thinking about, and that is not even someone who is tolerant, but someone who is willing to honor your right to decline a cesarean. Yeah, because that's like the very basis. Like, okay, they won't support you. They're not enthusiastic. They don't support you at all. Totally fine. Are they willing to at least honor your right to decline a cesarean? Because that's fundamentally all you need. They have all the skills to manage your labor, to perform a repeat cesarean if you need one. And all you need is for them to honor that right so you can labor. That's fundamentally the basis. And so when people say, well, my doctor's not supportive, that's my question for them. Will they at least do this? Because that is the ethical backbone. That is the final line, right? Every clinician should at least be there at a place where they're like, okay, well, I don't support this. I don't agree with this choice, but I'm not going to force you because it's not my place to do that. It is ultimately your choice and your responsibility.
That's it. That's like the bottom line. I think one of the things that's hard for me to see in these like VBAC groups where everyone's talking, they're like, get a new doctor. And not everyone can.
Many
And
people
also things like
yeah.
group practices. You can have people on the whole spectrum. So you have to take charge of it because people don't always have a choice. They just don't.
Yeah.
And that's unfortunate and it's horrible. And I wish people had a choice. But the reality is sometimes there aren't other options available. That's what you've got. You have to work with what's in front of you and make the best of it.
It's really hard, particularly for people who work at VBAC supportive facilities, to understand how absolutely isolating it can be to live in a good-sized city like Santa Barbara, and the only hospital in your community says your only option here is a repeat cesarean. We'll go to another, okay, so let's go 45 minutes south without traffic. Let's go an hour and a half to UCLA, which could easily be 3 or 4 hours with traffic. No one wants to be 5 or 6 centimeters on the road, and you are literally imprisoned on a freeway inside your car.
Yeah. Ask anyone who's been in labor. Where was the worst spot to be laboring? In the car. And what do I tell everybody? It'll get better when we get to the hospital and I get you out of it. So don't think this is like how your labor is going to feel.
But like finding another doctor, finding another hospital, like I hear people say that sometimes in such a blasé, casual way. And that is not the reality, especially in rural communities. You're really expecting someone to drive 300 miles to a tertiary level facility? That's 300 miles as the crow flies. That is not the ideal situation, especially when you have a facility like Cottage 10 minutes from your house who is perfectly capable of performing an emergency C-section. And yet arbitrary rule is put up saying you can't do that here. And people immediately think, oh, well, it must be illegal. It must be dangerous. Because of course, that would be the rational explanation, right? The only reason why a hospital wouldn't allow something is because it's so dangerous. They have to protect us from ourselves.
Yep. Yeah. And that's what people think. They're thinking like, this is so dangerous. And you're like, I mean, that was the blessing of having the perspective from Santa Cruz because we had 2 hospitals and I'm like, technically they were smaller. And so when everyone's like, and I'm like, no, like guys, it's smaller and they were doing it. So they could figure it out.
Are there still providers at Cottage who routinely recommend repeat cesareans for everyone?
Not routinely. I do think that if someone goes in uneducated, there are some that will definitely sway someone.
Yeah.
If you're educated at all, I don't think it would do much to you. You just kind of be like, oh, okay, cool. I see where you land. But there are some that are like, oh, you want to do that? Thankfully, not hearing a lot of real like bullying or pushing. There was one story in the mom group recently that I was kind of like appalled by. Everyone was appalled by and was like, that should probably be reported. But not the norm, thankfully. Not hearing that
and one thing I think is really important for parents to know is that we have research that has found that if your provider supports, if say I go to my doctor, right, and I get the sense that they support VBAC, I'm more likely to choose a VBAC. But if I go to my doctor and I get the sense that they would rather I have a repeat cesarean, that's what I'm more likely to choose. We have research that shows that behavior. So I think that's something important for people to clue into when they go in and first know the facts, know your rights, don't comply, and be persistent. Anastasia's 4 steps to righting the wrongs. But if you go in and you understand that dynamic, then when you hear them say, oh, but you can't do that, you're in the driver's seat.
We do tell people because we kind of have one group practice and then a couple independent practices. And so we really tell people like, hey, in this group practice, this is the person that's going to be, or we have a couple of them. These are the people that are going to be the most encouraging. They're literally going to have an attitude and an energy of encouraging you. So yes, you might not get them the day of, but if we're talking about your mindset going in, that's who you want your appointments with. And so we definitely have those conversations with people where we're like, that person is going to set you up in a headspace and an emotional space to be successful. And then you can navigate who's there on the day. So I just recently talked to someone and they were going to switch and make sure that their appointments were all with this one care provider, super confident going into the birth. But you want that person that's going to talk to you in that way when you see them, especially every week leading up, like you want someone that's positive. You don't want someone that's being negative. Even if it's the slightest bit gets in your head.
What's your advice for someone who says, but my OB won't let me plan a VBAC?
They don't get to let you do anything. They're not in charge of you. That's it. And I know that it's hard when that's what you're faced with and that's your only option. You've got nowhere else to go, whether it's insurance or you live in a small community and there just aren't options. But you can look at them and say, you're not allowed to not allow me.
Yeah.
You're just not. It's not your job. You don't have that power over me. You are actually working for me. Whether the insurance is writing you the check or I am, you're working for me. You're not in jail.
Yes. You aren't a prisoner. You are not a prisoner in the hospital. You do not have to comply.
And in all honesty, it's the only part of the hospital that we treat people like that.
Yes, it is. What do you think that is?
I mean, how deep do you want to go? Why did the doctors take away the births from the midwives? I don't know when this is going to air, but right now we're in Black History Month.
Yeah.
The stories of the granny midwives not losing one single baby pre-modern technology. And the doctors came in and were like, you don't know what you're doing, but we've got women dying in the hospital. Like, what? It goes back to then. It goes back to twilight sleep for birth, not believing women, not believing that they feel pain. Yeah, it goes way back. I think that that's really like the bottom line answer is that it's maybe not as like in your face that, but it's this leftover cultural thing where you come in, you sit down, be obedient. That's going back to the 1900s, and we still need to shake it. I tell people, like, you actually, do you know the history of childbirth in America? And not just America, right? It happened other places, but that's where we live. So do you know the history? And can you see how that is carrying over? Why do you have to ask permission? I mean, I will tell you that 16 years ago, when I really started going to births more often, the first thing I noticed that just like took me back and I went, wow, something's got to change, was the fact that the care providers would walk in the room and I don't believe anyone was doing this with malice intent at all, but they would walk into the room. I'm going to check you now.
Yeah.
No pause, no wait, no nothing. And I remember coming home and looking at my husband and going, we had 2 little girls at the time, thinking, we teach them nobody can touch you. No one should be touching your private areas. We tell girls this. We're telling them this. And then they go to have a baby and we flip it on its head. No one needs to ask before they touch you anymore. And I'm like, what are we doing? And that was kind of my like, what's happening here is so much deeper than just like, I have a fear of VBAC. It's literally, how are we treating people who are walking in these doors? And this is the only place it's happening. It's not happening in any other section of things, right? Like you get cancer. Okay, well, chemo's on the table. Well, I don't really want to do that, or I want to do it this way. Okay, let's have a conversation. But all of a sudden you can't have a conversation when it's birth. And I also think that that was my first lesson in the humanness of it, because I remember going to a nurse that I was friends with and I was like, hey, talk this through with you. Like, I feel so heavy about this. And I remember her pausing and just going, oh my gosh, Anastasia, you're right. I do that. And I just have never thought about it.
Yeah.
Because that's what happened to me. And that's what I was trained to do. And then I watched, and this was all in Santa Cruz. And then I watched in Santa Cruz as the nurses began to ask for consent.
Power of the nurses.
Yeah, they would just wait. It wasn't anything wild. they would just say like, hey, and then if they said no, they would be like, okay, well, I'm just going to go tell your care provider you don't want to be checked. And they would leave. It wasn't this radical moment. It was a one-on-one conversation. And I think that when we talk about like what's at the core of all of this, that's the core of VBAC too. And every other choice that someone makes in childbirth, whether it's pushing on their hands and knees or squatting next to a bed, getting an epidural or not getting an epidural, having a VBAC, having a C-section, it just comes back to the fact that we need to trust people to make the decision that's right for them. And knowing that two families might make two very different decisions with the exact same information.
Yes. Morally neutral. It's morally neutral.
Yeah, there's not a right or wrong.
Yeah.
And it's going to be different for everybody.
So looking back, what do you wish you knew at the beginning of this process? Like if now Anastasia 16 years later could go back and be like, oh, sweet youngin', let me give you some hot tips on how to advocate in the most effective way.
I think I'd lean a little more on human connection at the beginning. I think that's something that I learned along the way. What I'm thankful for, so I'm going to like kind of mess with your question, was that I wasn't afraid of anything. I didn't know what I didn't know, and so I wasn't afraid of it. I was like, fine, let's have our prayer test. Like I later got a little bit jaded because I got some like pushback and in trouble. Not in trouble. That's not the right word. I got some pushback for some things I said and some veiled that made me pause. And if that had happened at the beginning, I don't know what I would have done, actually.
Yeah.
Also, my husband calls me justice girl. Like, I don't like it when things are not, when you're not treating people right. So I think it's really taught me to be comfortable saying things that make people uncomfortable sometimes, and that I can do that in a loving way and still love them as a person, but challenge the space that we're in. We have 5 kids and 3 daughters and 2 sons, and with the girls and their friends, just really looking at them being like, I don't want you guys to go through this, and watching it affect them and the way they speak to their friends and tell their friends like, hey, that shouldn't happen to you. About even bigger things than just birth, right? And then the boys too, the boys are younger, but every once in a while you'll get these gems from them. They're in the space of processing it on a more mature level. But I think I remember, I'm really going to mess it up a little bit, but my 13-year-old said something and he goes, well, yeah, a woman should do that. And I was like, what do you mean? And he was like, do you want to know why I said that? And I was like, yeah, why did you say that? He was like, because let's be real, they just do it better. Like, but it was this moment of like, he views them as like powerful and deserving respect. And I was like, oh, you're like only 13. Yeah, like they don't even understand their life.
Yeah.
And so I just thought that was interesting that stuck with him, and even from a young age, that like birth wasn't icky and gross. It was something to be admired and to be respected, and that knowing how it works was something you should take pride in. Everyone should know how this works. Advocacy for the world, I've always viewed it as it starts at home. Somewhere, some place, I picked up the idea of like, what's your sphere of influence? And focus on that, because it can get really overwhelming. Like if I was like, I'd like to get rid of every VBAC ban, I'd get overwhelmed and I'd be defeated and done. There's no way. I don't have that sphere of influence. I don't work in the federal government. Like I can't do that. That is not the sphere of influence I have. But sometimes your sphere of influence changes, right? Like if I end up at a dinner table with a senator, well, that's my moment. I've ended up at parties with the chief of OB at the hospital. So I can be scared, or I could use the opportunity to make a connection. And I think that's right. Like that would be, as I look back, the huge piece where I feel like I've been able to walk into uncomfortable situations knowing like this was placed in front of me for a reason and I quite maybe know what it is and it might not be huge in this moment, but like I'm going to step into this place and just be a human with this person. That's it. That's all I want to do is just be a human with them. And I've had some of the most amazing conversations
Yeah.
with people that, I've been told before that person will never support what we're doing. And I'm like, I'm not going to give up because I believe humans can change. I've changed.
And may we all be capable of growth and change.
Yeah.
And learning new information and saying, oh, I didn't know that before.
Yeah. Or just even,
Yeah.
Right? Because really at the end of the day, like what you were talking about, it's like someone going to respect your basic right. It's really at the bottom line, viewing us all as humans and going like,
Yes.
you know what? That's not a choice that I would make
Yeah.
for myself or my family or whatever.
Yeah.
Because I see you and I see your heart in it and I see what's happening to you if you aren't able to have access to that. And so, yeah, I guess at the bottom line, it's like, it's all connection.
So what advice do you have for others who want to reverse a VBAC ban?
Start slow. Just do one thing and education. Like education's the key. Of course, I'm going to plug like starting an ICANN chapter. It's just help. The only reason I really say it, I've been involved in it for a long time, but it gives you help. You're not alone. It gives you people who've been doing it for a while. It gives you ideas. You can kind of hear what's going on in different places. But their whole mission is to educate, advocate, and support. And so when you create support groups where people come together and are like, hey, we're all struggling with the same thing and this is really hard for us, it starts to create change. And then you're doing education too. So the whole idea behind ICANN is that everything's free for the community. I think when we do that and we create these spaces, that then it starts to flow. I know that what we did was kind of wild, having a VBAC panel, and might sound super big and overwhelming to someone, but it really, I told the story, it was really pretty simple in the end. So it was like grabbing a couple of people who we knew had facts and information and could relay them about statistical things. And we grabbed a couple of moms to share their stories. And that still remains the whole layout for that.
Yeah.
Cheap or free place to have it. And it will likely start out small and that's fine. You can team up with the library and say, we want to do this educational event. Get the library to get on board. Get someone to host it, that it matters to them. It doesn't have to be complicated. It doesn't.
What do you wish every birth professional knew about reversing VBAC bans?
Birth professionals that are trying to come up against and change a VBAC ban, I'm going to go back to spheres of influence. Look at what your sphere of influence is. How can you get the ear of someone that can help you to talk to people and educate yourself? So back to education, like you need to be educated so you can walk in the door armed with knowledge. And then for those who are holding up bans at their facilities, I would ask you to pause and think about what you're doing to families. Like, it's really, really heavy to rip that option away from families or force them to fight in a moment that should be free of fighting for your rights.
What's the most important thing you want people to remember from your story?
You're not alone and just don't give up. Keep going.
Yeah. Anastasia, thank you so much for coming and chatting with me today. I really appreciate it. This podcast is all about showing people what is possible relative to VBAC. And you've shown what is possible. It is possible to create enough momentum in the community to change hospital policy. Cottage may never even acknowledge the role that played. And yet they would not have changed policy had the pressure not been there, as evidenced from how long the policy was there. They didn't do it out of the goodness of their heart. They did it because ultimately there was enough pressure from the community that the community would no longer tolerate it.
Yeah. Thanks for
Yeah.
having me.
Absolutely. I'll see you next time. Until then, I'm Jen Kamel from VBAC Facts, and don't forget what we're about. Since 2007, our focus has been to share accurate and objective information about vaginal birth after cesarean and repeat cesarean to parents, professionals, policymakers, and the court, so all decisions can be informed, ethical, and just. I'll see you next time.